This is a bit of a continuation, isn't it, of one sort of the basics sort of in composition that we did earlier in the year?
It is, yeah. Obviously, the first one that we did, gosh, it was last year, wasn't it, Jay?
I think it was
When we did it.
very early in the beginning of the year, I think, yes.
Yeah, a while ago. Anyway, it's still on. It's still online, so you can certainly have a look at the original starting point for compositional presentation I did. You'll find, for those of you who have seen it recently or who remember the first slideshow, we'll see some overlap between this one and the kind of ideas I'm discussing with this one and the previous one. That's for the sake of continuity, really. So I say it's a good idea, perhaps if you want to at a later stage, perhaps review this one in line with the other one. They kind of make sense if viewed together.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Nigel, I'm going to hand you the screen.
Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. Hopefully you'll find this evening's presentation informative. As I mentioned earlier on, it is a continuation of one I've done before, and there is a overlap with some of the ideas, but hopefully a little bit of repetition never goes amiss anyway. So what I'm going to try and do is to cover more advanced compositional ideas and the themes, how I draw images together in terms of compositional thinking. So hopefully you'll recognize a number of styles I've used, a number of methods I've used to achieve a certain compositional theme or a compositional style that you can start to develop. Now, there are a range of ideas in here, and there are many more. I've just picked on a few key ideas, general principles, which you'll, no doubt, some of which you'll be familiar with, and others perhaps you'll be less familiar with, and hopefully I'll sort of try to open your eyes in terms of how you can start to develop your own photography in a variety of different ways. Examples of how we put images together, and that'll make sense, a little bit more sense once we get into it. Understanding composition, and this covers more general ideas like you'll be familiar with, like lead-in lines, like the rule of thirds, like those things that probably you'll understand how to apply them, but perhaps I'm going to try and go into a little bit more depth. How you can develop that into particular compositional themes, how you can pull images together in terms of compositional style. And there are two I've picked out in particular which I focus on quite heavily in terms of how I apply and use foreground and how I use highlights. These are just two themes. There are many more that I could apply as well, but believe me, this presentation is it's quite extensive as it is. Now, I may not get through the entire presentation here, but not to worry. I'll continue it in a future one. So we'll see how that one goes. So, what this covers, whether we take abstract or literal images. Now, there's a range of images here which are very different in style. I've tried to group them together into twos. Now, one is quite an abstract approach, where effectively the focus is on form, on line, on shape, on color, and the other images alongside them are more literal. They are pretty much as you see them. They're perfectly well taken. They use foreground reasonably well, they use nice lighting, but they're very literal images. You could identify where anyone who knows those particular places in Wales, they all happen to be in Wales, could identify where they've been taken. For those of you who don't know, the waterfalls area in the Brecon Beacons, Pen-y-Fan itself, and Three Cliffs Bay. The others are more about the photographic interpretation. So taking the bottom one as an example, the bottom right-hand side one, the backlighting, the form of the rocks, all those kind of things which you look for as a photographer, but it could be taken anywhere. That is secondary to the photographic or visual effect. Whereas the Three Cliffs Bay one, straightforward picture, but perfectly commercially saleable. And in fact, if you're selling images, generally that kind of image will sell more than the more abstract kind. I go for the more abstract kind, but that's my personal approach. So there's no right or wrong about it. But think about effectively what kind of style you're going to start off with. So how do we identify abstract form with our images? So all these effectively, think not so much about I am taking a picture of a house, a mountain, a lighthouse, a field, or a location Durdle Door, Three Cliffs Bay, wherever you happen to be taking a photograph of, think about how you can interpret that in photographic terms. So all these images hopefully are quite good examples. Online, they depend on form, and they depend on simplicity of one or two features, lines or colors to make them work. So try to think in terms of your photography, in terms of not so much what you're photographing, it's how you're interpreting it. In fact, one of the things I do regularly on my workshops is to do a simple compositional exercise with participants. Take them to a location and say, see if you can find a set of identifiable subjects, and follow a theme and see how you can interpret it. And it's a very good way of understanding how you're not so much photographing a subject, but it's how you're interpreting it. It's so far working, this. It's good after a particularly inauspicious start. So, how you identify a compositional style. Now, after the next couple of slides, by the way, I'm going to have a little break just in case anyone's got any questions to come in with. So at that point, I'm going to ask Jay to ask, see whether you've come into Jay and ask any questions. So a few thoughts here. There's 4 sets of 2 images. Now, each one, as you can tell, the subject matter is quite different. Particularly the top 2, people photography, landscape photography, architectural photography. But if you look at the 2 sets of images, compositionally, they are very, very similar. The first one, the shadow used to the foreground with the sun and the trees in the background, the plank leading to the person doing the wood planing. Second lot of images on the top right-hand side. For anyone who's familiar with Castell Coch near Cardiff, that's a picture of it taken from below. The 2 turrets with the diagonal of the ramparts, likewise the 2 people holding the plank of wood. So they are compositionally, each of these images, compositionally you're using the same basic construction. So try to develop compositional thinking and ideas that you can apply in a variety of situations. It will help you think in terms of how you form or effectively design your images, which is the term I prefer to use, then I am taking a picture of a particular subject. The tendency is, particularly for landscape photographers, is I'm going to go to, as I mentioned, Durdle Door earlier, but you could probably list a list of 10 UK most familiar places, St Michael's Mount, Bamborough Castle, Durdle Door, and a few others, most of them are coastal actually, funnily enough, but are iconic places to take pictures from. Try to develop your photography, particularly thinking about your own locality, and that places that you know, places that inspire you, that you live in, that you know and understand, and see how you can interpret them. And think of that as being your landscape photography, rather than, if you like to coin a phrase, following the crowd, because that's what tends to happen in photography these days. And in fact, since the introduction of Facebook a few years ago, of course, and Facebook groups, possibly even more so. So try and think about your own approach to photography. So another compositional style. Now, two other comparisons. If you look at the 2 images on the left-hand side, one's a viaduct, one's a greenhouse roof. Compositionally, with the shape of the diagonal and the other lines leading towards the diagonal, virtually identical in terms of image composition. The 2 on the right-hand side, one's the Dolomites, one's taken at Tinton Abbey. Guess which one's which. Compositionally, apart from the lines in the sky, virtually the same. In terms of the form of the image, virtually identical. So yet a couple of other examples in terms of how you can pull similar images together. Again, 4 pictures again using similar construction. Very low horizon line because the emphasis is on the sky. The top one perhaps slightly different in that respect. Vertical features. Breaking the horizon line. So effectively it's 2 rectangles with a series of features on the bottom. So there's quite a similar approach to these style of images. Right, that's a natural break in there, Jay. Has anybody asked you any questions yet?
Yeah, we've had a couple, so they'll probably fit us now. Actually, the first question that came in with regards to composition, do you find that the composition alters if you are effectively looking at the final image in your head being black and white? So do we approach things differently for a black and white image?
It's a very good question, and yes. Black and white is about grayscale and shade and tones, and some images work extremely well in black and white, and not in all those images you can see in front of me there. Pretty much would be difficult in black and white, apart from perhaps the one on the bottom right. The best way to think of a black and white is to think in black and white as you're taking it. Is it about tone? Is color striking you? The reason why, fundamentally, the question to ask yourself is, why am I taking this picture? And if one of those reasons is the strength of color, then it's primarily going to be a color image. If it is about tone and light and shade and tonal gradation, then it's likely to work well in black and white. The approach is generally to think in black and white before you take it. Color, if you're thinking in color, then generally the color image will be stronger.
Excellent. Okay, this is just a general question, but when taking your image, do you meter in camera, Nigel, or do you use a light meter?
Right. The difference between probably what I teach people and what I do is like the question of don't do as I do, do as I say. Technically, what you should be doing is to meter on 18% grey, a grayscale, because then the camera is rendering effectively the picture in terms of the tones you see in front of you. So good grayscales are Caucasian skin tones, blue sky, lit grass, those kind of things are very good for measuring mid-grade. So that's a good starting point, because then effectively you'll render the highlights and the shadows, unless they're extreme, pretty much as you can see them in front of you. You adjust from that. In reality, I shoot entirely manual exposure, virtually entirely, and certainly entirely for my landscapes, because I like the ability to fine-tune adjustment. And also, the fact is, in manual exposure, you are effectively reading, you're setting the camera for a light level, which you only need to change the exposure if the light level changes. So that's my preferred option. So I do use in camera, but I have an idea of my head, looking at what the exposure reading is, and basically set the camera for that, and I'm usually pretty accurate. So actually, if hand on heart, I rarely even look at the meter, but that's not what I teach people. So what I teach people is to look for grey, use the meter to read for grey. So there's a difference in my approach, because I think I've got a reasonable eye for light level and what my and the reading my camera should be reading. I don't often get it far wrong.
Brilliant. Okay, I thought this was a nice question.
That's an honest reply.
Very honest. Very honest. Yeah. How does Nigel research his locations? Well, that was a good question.
That's another really good question, actually. I could take the webinar up with this one, with the answer to this one if you wanted me to, but I might get boring, so I won't. My photography falls into two halves. Those which are my images which are totally spontaneous, in which are completely unresearched. I will basically just go out, find an approximate spot, and just go for a walk and explore. Nearly all my favorite images, if I was going to list 25, 30 top favorite images, every single one would have been taken like that. So they are totally spontaneous. I come up with whatever I come up with and whatever I find. In terms of exploring other locations, I will kind of vaguely look at the map. I don't do much internet research, have to say. I'm not one for poring over other people's locations and having a look. I prefer to find my own. And I like to think that's generally why I've got hopefully a bit more of a lot of my images are quite individual. Now, you'll see from that image on the top right of the screen, everyone recognized that as being the House of Parliament. For those who've been to Istanbul, everyone will recognize that as Hagia Sophia, which is, you know, a pretty famous monument. So all those are actually quite familiar places. So yes, I absolutely do go to popular places, and I will just go and think, okay, that's my destination. But what I'll often find when I go there is actually a whole variety of different other places which I prefer. And sometimes when I go to visit these locations, I'll end up never actually getting there because there's so much around. You think, oh, ooh, the light's done that. The light's caught that place in a certain way. So that'll distract me. But as I said, nearly all my favorite images where I simply just gone out for the day, taken my camera, put it in a bag, gone out for a walk, and seen what I come up with.
Brilliant. I've got quite a few sort of generic questions that I'm going to hang on to for a minute, but the last one before we move on is a question that is it acceptable to accept converging verticals as in the image of the Palace of Westminster? Is that the one we've got on now?
Why not? Why not? I kind of like the way they point up towards the birds.
Yeah, I think I mean a lot of people get hung up on these. But a lot of people get hung up on these rules of things, isn't there? There are times where you've just got to take an image.
Sure, carry on, Jake. Yeah.
Well, no, I just interested in how you thought about that. I mean, yeah, you know, we all learn and we follow rules, and there are times and places for it. But also there are times where you should just take the image, and then, you know, you've seen something in the image, and obviously that's key to sharing it with people. But there are times and places for everything, isn't there?
Absolutely, and I'd say in that particular example, I quite like the way almost the converging verticals make the towers look as though they're reaching up to the sky.
Brilliant.
So I far prefer that to the vertical.
And it's telling stories, isn't it, as well? You know, the images tell stories, so brilliant. Great, well, I'm going to hang on to the other few questions, because like I said, they're more generic, so we'll hang on to those for a bit later. There you go, it's all back to you, mate.
All right, we'll never get to the end of this presentation, I tell you. Right, okay, right, so some of these will be quite familiar to you. Using leading lines that draw the eye into the image. Now, I have covered this in the presentation I've done previously, but it's worth reiterating. Briefly understanding what the rule of thirds is about and how you could apply it. Application of foreground, and there's a lot more I've got in this presentation later on, using symmetry. The two rectangle image construction, I've just shown you that in a previous slide, but I will talk a little bit more about that, and using highlights. So, moving on to these. So, lead-in lines. Think of your picture as your image construction as something that takes your eye through the picture. Effectively, it's taking your eyes on a visual journey. What you don't want to do is this is a way with many styles of images, effectively, of using the features to draw your viewer's eye in and want the eye to explore the picture. Now, you can do that in several different ways, using a different style and a different type of lead-in line. It's a familiar lead-in or leading, I've heard as well. Same thing. And it tends to be a generic term that's used, a lead-in line. But as you can see, hopefully from these examples I'm going to show you, they can capture a mood or interpret what's in front of you in very different ways. So these are diagonals. Diagonals are quite dynamic. They're quite strong. Take your eyes into the picture and out again, perhaps very, very quickly. So they're quite strong and they're quite high impact. And you can see a variety of examples here. Two I'm going to point out in particular, the one with the track running through the field, and the one with the building with a line of posts in a sandstorm halfway down on the right-hand side. Now, compositionally, those are similar, but two things distinguish them. Firstly, the continuous line on the first one through the field, and you've got a broken line on the second one. So that distinguishes the two. The effect is the same on the broken line because it still takes your eye through the picture. Also, the second one with the building happens to be the visitor centre on the Leslie coastline, if anyone knows it. It's a stop point on the image. So basically, the lead-in line leads to that stop point. On the first image, the field, There is no stop point there. Basically, the line takes your eye straight the way through. So it almost invites some aspect, an element of infinity there. It has nothing to stop the eye. So no wrong or right about it, but just a different approach to a similar, effectively a similar image construction. The other one here that's obviously quite dramatically different is the one with the strong perspective lines, Penarth Pier. Anyone knows it? Not too far, not all that far away from where Jay is sitting right now, 5 miles-ish. And that has everything obviously leading to a central point. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So a single curve leading line. Again, similar compositional idea. These are all leading lines. The dominant feature is the curve itself. The background is important in the picture, but it is dominated by the strength of the curve. Typically, I would say, but not entirely, these style of images, you'll be using a wide-angle lens, because effectively it will accentuate the strength of the curve. The beginning of the curve will dominate the foreground, particularly when you've got a texture effect, when you've got a texture or a pattern like the paving pattern in the foreground on the one on the far left-hand side. Depth of field, I would say, is particularly significant for this kind of picture. For those of you who aren't aware, I'm sure most of you are, but depth of field controlled primarily primarily by the lens aperture. So using a small aperture in the lens is important. Using a low foreground, that low viewpoint, I beg your pardon, does emphasize foreground. So typically, again, not in every case, but typically most of these pictures will also be using a low viewpoint for that emphasis. So that's moving a step on. If I move a step on from there, a meandering leading line. They're all, as I mentioned, they all take your eye on a visual journey through the picture. They are all leading lines, but a different type of image. So again, the foreground, the leading line itself, can in some cases, particularly in the bottom, well, actually most of these, are largely the picture in itself. The picture with a person in it, probably the leading line itself, is actually secondary in that picture. That's because there are people in it. People tend to dominate. The eye is instantly drawn to them. Again, typically using wide-angle lens, but not in every case. A couple of these are in fact telephoto pictures. Finally, on leading lines, where you're using a series of features to take your eye through the picture. So either a continuous series, as in the line of posts, or the line of rocks, the curve in the rocks on the right-hand side, taken at Glenative, Scotland. Strong perspective, the one in the middle, stepping stones on Gower. And the two similar ones, one taken in Wiltshire, one taken at, if anyone knows, Big Plit on Blind Avon, it's quite a good spot. In fact, I took a customer up there today, it's quite a regular spot of mine. Both of those are very similar. As you can tell, one's the reverse of the other. Effectively, you're using two features to take the eye through the picture. The one on the bottom right, you're using three features to take the eye through the picture. They are all effectively doing the same thing. They're all lead-ins, they're all lead-in lines, but they're implied lines as opposed to continuous lines. And you'll see from all the previous ones, hopefully it does work good, all the previous ones, diagonals, simple curve, and meandering lines, very different feel and style for the picture. That's much more restful, dreadful expression, but probably the best I can think of, or much more static feel to this, which is much more dynamic, much more movement. So think about how you're applying and using lead-in lines. Rule of thirds. A few examples here. Rule of thirds, effectively, if you imagine your picture as a noughts and crosses board, and you put your main subject, if your picture has a main subject, on one of the intersections. Now, typically, and in all these cases, we tend to use one of the lower thirds because what you're doing is effectively using your main subject to create context for the background. So you're using the main subject to draw your eye to context. If you have a central composition, your eye is drawn straight to the main subject. Here, effectively, you're creating space, you're creating context. More often than not, we tend to place the subject, and it really is a generalization, this, because there clearly are two exceptions here, on the left-hand side because we read from left to right. We tend to be more comfortable using the left. However, as you can tell, I've got two examples here using the right. Compositionally, if I'm going to go into compositional theme, like I mentioned earlier, the one with the single standing tree and the upright of the old Severn Bridge are pretty identical composition, with the exception of one diagonal running through the bridge. So again, it's showing an example of where I've used effectively a compositional style to demonstrate how you can use these. You can bring images together. So next slide. These are other order thirds as well, but all these are characterized by having two features. One of which is main features on the third, but they've also got, each one of these has got a supporting feature. So, and the two features are set up on a diagonal. Now, hopefully one thing that you'll get an impression from all these pictures is they aren't just general views. It's very clear where these have been taken. So there are, go back to the word simplicity. Simplicity is important, I think, in landscape photography and in developing a style. It's picking out shape, it's picking out form, it's picking out hopefully your own identity. So this is a way in which you can just use two images, set them up on a diagonal. So whereas these have one main subject, and generally with these, the backdrop and the landscape is important. With these, primarily, the backdrop and landscape is less important to actually the effect of the two images working together. This is a continuation. You'll recognize a couple of these because I showed you them earlier on. Simple image construction using color. Now, if I can just use the as an example, the one with the grey sky and the oilseed rape field, the yellow field, with a line of trees running through. Now, that image could easily be, for example, the red sky, the power station, and the sea in the foreground. The image construction of those, effectively two rectangles with a line of features in the middle, in the same way as the Houses of Parliament is as well, then your image construction is pretty much the same. You're using the same idea in terms of forming the images, and hopefully I'm getting the message across that this will encourage you to produce simple pictures. Again, using the word simplicity. In all these, the weight is given to the sky because it's that emphasis I wanted to give. Ideally, perhaps with the one on the right, the bottom right-hand side, which is on the North Yorkshire coast, and it's an abbey, and somebody will no doubt tell me. So hopefully somebody will remind me the name of the abbey. As again, I'd have perhaps wanted stars in the sky then. It just was a full moon. I couldn't see many of the stars.
Whitby Abbey.
So these are Whitby. Thank you. Did somebody shout that one out?
They did, because I didn't know, but several people did. To be
Actually,
fair,
it's one of those names which escaped me. Thank you very much, whoever shouted it out. Excellent. So these similar image style again. So these, the previous ones, color examples. These are black and white examples using the same idea. A base for the picture, a very strong base. Good example of the one with the houses on the buildings on the top left-hand side. It's a base for the sky. So you're using that landscape to give the sky weight and give the sky emphasis. Now, people refer to it's on my last presentation about where you put horizon lines. You often hear, don't put your horizon line in the middle of the frame. Well, that one itself is actually misleading because it's all about visual balance. And people tend to refer to a third of the way up or a third of the way down. It really is a generalization. Now, these are generally lower than a third, and in fact, so are these as well. Because I want to give weight to the sky. That's my emphasis to the picture. So think about, when you're thinking about horizon line, it's got one. Of course, I've got plenty of examples of photographs here which have no horizon line in because it's not that style of image. But where you have, think about the emphasis of the picture you're looking for rather than any preconceived rule. If your emphasis is the sky, think about how you can give weight to the sky. If your emphasis is the landscape because of its shape, its form, its lines, then think about how you can maximize the impact, the positioning of the sky and the weight of the sky to give emphasis to that. The only thing I would say about sky is that do not have a small strip of sky at the top of the picture. It usually looks like a mistake and usually needs cropping out. If the sky isn't important in the image, then exclude it. So because your image then will be about the form, the shape and form and the features in the landscape and less about the sky. Good examples where you perhaps might want to exclude the sky is where literally, as I said, is a pattern in the landscape, or whether perhaps you've got a featureless white sky and your emphasis is you wanted to attract emphasis away from that. So the sky land balance is an important one, and I've just shown a few examples here in black and white where I think we had the answer earlier on, where whether you choose black and white or color. These are very much black and white images. Strong emphasis on tonal variation, on light and shade, on the subtleties of black and white. A couple of these are in long exposures. If those of you who recall my last webinar on long exposure photography, or those of you who were there, will remember I emphasized the use of black and white quite strongly in long exposure photography because it lends itself to that sort of tonal gradation, that interest in tones quite significantly. The only other thing I'm going to point out on this slide is that myself and a fellow photographer, John Farnan, I mentioned in the last webinar again, are running some workshops on the Isle of Skye in, well, November's full, but next February. And the cottage we're staying in, it's that cottage on the right-hand side, a lovely spot just underneath the Coolins. So moving on. Oh, similar one. I actually didn't think I had another style on this, another slide on this theme. So difference between these, again, simple images of sky and land. With these, the landscape more is about the detail within the landscape. So whether it's poppies, oilseed rape, a stone pattern, or daffodils, the image itself is similar in style. Very simple, two rectangle image construction, straightforward, but they can be effective, particularly when you've got strong tones or strong colors. Here I've used coloring as the theme. I think, going back to that question of black and white or color, the only one of these I would perceive working in black and white, and I haven't got a black and white version, it's probably worth trying it, is the one with stones and the sun setting, because that is about light and shade, it is about tonal variation. The others are very, very strongly color images, which simply wouldn't work in black and white. Radial composition. So moving on completely from that, actually there's a similarity in terms of the two rectangles, but these originate from the center. So typically this style of image will have its focus point right in the center of the image, and everything else radiates out from the center. Now three of these, it is 3 or 4 actually, use long exposures. Now long exposures, what they will do if you use them in the right, if you've got the wind in the right direction, will create cloud movement. Now that cloud movement can be used to quite positive effect because it will automatically produce lines if you've got the wind in the right direction radiating out from the center. So I've used various ways of balancing the exposure of the cloud movement by using the foreground effect. So with the one on the top left, I've used the lines of the planking on the pier. Very strong perspective effect, taking the eye into the distant. The one below it, it's taken on the Tyne in Newcastle. I've simply used a reflection of the sky in the water to create that similar effect. Again, central feature, very similar compositional to the composition to the one of Big Ben in terms of the small central feature, but the eye is drawn straight to it. A slight variation from that is a different style of composition where effectively I've used the building, again that's taken on in Newcastle, actually it's the Sage Centre in Gateshead, where I've used the building to radiate the sky lines and the step lines around the building, so it almost wraps itself around the building structure. So there's a similarity between that composition and say the one of Penarth Pier, in that everything radiates towards the centre, although one's got a slightly different style in that the second one almost rotates, whereas the first one is a very strong diagonal composition. As I mentioned earlier, this is just a set of ideas which you can apply and use them in various situations. The other two images I'm just going to point to very quickly. The one with the waterfall in the centre, similar effect created by the splash of water, and obviously the strong paving pattern of a line of trees does this very similar thing in the one in the picture on the bottom right. Talking about iconic locations, by the way, the waterfall is below the Buckell Etive Moor in Scotland, which is probably one of the most photographed places on the whole planet. Everyone seems to go there, and I'm sure most photographers have got a picture of it one way who've ever been up there. It's an interesting photographic style, this one. I quite like it. So think about long exposures, think about foreground, think about how you can use foreground features to complement the effect you get in the sky, in this style of image. Square composition. Square pictures are quite interesting in that there aren't too many. Our cameras take 3x2. Typically, most of your cameras that you have got now will be taking 3x2 format pictures. You might crop them in various ways. You might crop them into Panoramix. You might shoot them portrait format. There are some images simply through their image construction lead to a taking in square format. Typically, not always, but typically, the focal point is probably almost the image surroundings draw towards the center, and primarily these images do. These lend themselves to a square composition. Incidentally, I've got a 6 centimeter square old Bronica camera, which I'm keep on meaning to dust off, and probably going to go with me to Sky actually, which takes square pictures. And it's quite interesting actually, when you're looking at a square viewfinder, you tend to think more square. And we tend to be often dictated by what's in the camera. As a general rule, try not to be dictated by what you see in the camera. Think about what's in front of you and using the format that's best applicable to what's in front of you. And think about the cropped image as opposed to the 3x2 aspect ratio, is what we call it, image that you can see through the viewfinder. So, symmetry. Very briefly on this one. Generally water, because water creates reflections, or anything which creates a reflection of the landscape. So these are perfect symmetry images. Effectively, apart from a little bit of blurring in the water admittedly, but by and large you've got a mirror image in the top compared to the bottom of the picture. Horizon line, usually in the center of the frame, because it's about balanced composition. It would be very difficult to imagine with any of these shots having the horizon line anything else right down the middle, simply because it's symmetry, and therefore anything you do would look unbalanced. You do I often see reflection images where people have used the third of the way up, and it's simply, in my mind, it just doesn't work. So you need these right down the middle, I think. So conversely, I've mentioned a few key points here. Calm mornings, usually in the morning, absolutely, calm conditions rather. Often you'll get, particularly with water, there'll be a little bit more turbulence, so usually these style of images are best taken first thing. Asymmetrical composition. So broadly, composition is you've got a reflection in the water, but there's something in the foreground which gives it an element of asymmetry. So you're using the basic symmetrical composition, but taking a little bit of a stage further and adding a little bit of variation in terms of how you apply the foreground. Now that could mean you change the weight of the emphasis between sky and foreground. In the three of these, though, I have actually kept the horizon line right in the middle. That's because I think the visual balance, because the asymmetry is so slight, that I think the balance of the picture is still best achieved by having the horizon line right in the middle of the frame. Technique I sometimes use just to deliberately get a bit of asymmetry is to throw a pebble in the water, which just I personally find it a little bit more interesting than an absolute mirror image. So make sure it's a pebble, not a brick. I had a customer last week who threw a brick in and it just created a splash, which is probably not the best thing to do. Couple of examples here, talking about the last two things, radial composition from symmetry. This is quite an interesting comparison because effectively what you're doing is with a short exposure, I use one of these examples to show the symmetry. With a short exposure, you are effectively getting a symmetrical composition, but that's turning it into a more radial effect by using a long exposure because you're getting the sky movement moving in the water and everything's got the appearance as though it's radiating out from the center because you're turning static subjects into lines. So that's quite an interesting, if you want to go to look at radial compositions and how you can apply them, long exposures are a good way of doing that. Now, one of the things I covered in one of my previous webinars is use of filters. Now, obviously with long exposures, particularly in broad daylight, then you will need neutral density filters. You'll need to reduce the amount of light going into the lens very significantly. So that's why Lee, Nissi and others produce 10-stop or even darker filters to give you some flexibility in terms of using long exposures. These ones at the bottom, they're about 2.5 to 3 minutes, and it does how much the length of exposure you need depends. A lot of it depends on the wind, how much wind there is. As again, you can see from these I mentioned earlier, wind direction is important. Generally, to or away from the camera will produce those streaks in that direction. So wind direction obviously is an influencing factor as well. Using foreground. So I've got a few examples. Oh, actually, I've reached the end of a section here. So, Jay, anyone got any questions?
Well, Nigel, there's a lot of questions, so I think maybe if we get through the next bit and then we'll concentrate on the questions, and then obviously I know we've probably run over a bit, but obviously we're happy to answer the questions as long as you're happy to stay online with us. But I think that's probably easiest. Yeah. If we're going to cover the foreground bit, let's cover that, and then we'll ask all the questions that I have on screen at the moment for you. But there's a good few there, so it might take us a few minutes.
Okay.
You crack on, pal.
Yep, we'll do. Right, foreground. It's everyone, I think, I'm sure, who's picked up a camera has heard of use of foreground and how you can apply it. Effectively, you're creating a setting for a background to an image. So, classic example of a foreground picture. The grass is coming out of the snow with some very familiar looking mountains in the background. Those of you who know Glencoe area, and if you don't know it and have never been there, do go. It's one of the most stunning places on earth, in my opinion. Those are one of the three sisters and the Buckle, Buckellid more in the background, and the very, very well-known white cottage as well. So I'm going to show you a few examples of the way in which you can use foreground. Now I should point out, obviously, that a lot of the previous images also use foreground, and these ideas I'm hopefully throwing at you or themes are not mutually exclusive. A lot of the images I've shown you use highlights, they use foreground, they use all those tools as well. So try and think about the different ways in which you can use imagery. So these typical foreground images. You've got emphasis on the foreground. Now typically these will use a low viewpoint because a low viewpoint places emphasis on the foreground. When you stand up, so typically I will not be standing up taking these pictures. I'll probably be kneeling on the ground or sometimes on occasion lying on the ground, but usually a low viewpoint will reduce the effect in the middle ground, place emphasis on this foreground and its relation on the background. So you'll find these are quite typical landscape pictures in which you've got a strong foreground feature against a background feature. Now, a few things on this. Firstly, depth of field is important. Therefore, the aperture you choose in making sure your image is sharp from front to back in nearly all situations like this will be very, very important. Secondly, think about the proportion between your foreground and background. Now, there is a tendency, and all landscape photographers do it, me included, to go with the widest angle lens and place emphasis or dominance on the foreground, and that one on the top left-hand side is a very, very typical example. But there is a danger with that. It's visually strong, but there is sometimes a danger with that in reducing the emphasis or scale on the background to something smaller that you intend, because effectively the wider angle lens you're using, the more you're changing the relationship between your foreground feature and your background feature. So it's important to remember that when you're composing these style of images, how much emphasis do you want to place on the background in relation to the foreground? If you want that background to have more emphasis, stand further back and use a longer focal length, because it does change that relationship. So yeah, low viewpoint, wide angle lens typically, and depth of field are critical to these kind of pictures. These have got a more textured foreground, so you can see what brings these into play, emphasizes these pictures more, is the texture in the foreground. Now, either sand or an estuary, the one on the Severn Bridge, those of you recognize Severn Bridge, is mud as opposed to sand. The rest of them are more sand, and there's some grasses there as well. But the emphasis on here, on the image style here, is on a foreground texture. So the other foreground images I showed you earlier on use grass, certain subjects I know one I've duplicated. Is it going to go back a little bit too far? I might as well. Yeah, these obviously use a different kind of foreground, similar style of image, but use color, primarily use color as the foreground, whereas those, probably shouldn't jump around like this too much, use texture as your foreground. Again, you're using different compositional ideas and using different landscape elements to pull images together. Image construction with these, it's using foreground, but the main subject on these images is on the thirds as opposed to these, which is broadly, and those which broadly are a general landscape view. These have a specific focal point. So whether it's a tower, a tree, a lighthouse, a rock, what have you, all of these draw to a single point, which is roughly placed on the thirds. As I mentioned earlier, there's no absolute about this. This is a rule of thumb, and rules are there to be used as a guideline as and when they apply. These happen to be using the rule of thirds. Now, the next set I've got, unless I've got the slides out of place, which wouldn't be unknown. Good, they are in place. Have the central focal point in the middle. So see a distinction between those are off-center, those towards the center. Use the foreground to draw the eye right towards the center of the frame. So these are quite strong in comparison because they place much more emphasis on the background subject in terms of a simple foreground and its relationship to its background, draw the eye towards the center of the frame. So in that respect, I prefer that composition to those because in my mind they're stronger in terms of their impact because the eye is drawn straight towards center, straight to the center. Just to pick up on a point I made a minute ago about being careful with how you apply and use wide-angle lenses. Now, the picture on the bottom left-hand side, Saltwick Bay, North Yorkshire coast, is quite a good example of that. The rock in the center of the frame is about 20 to 25 meters high. I'm sure there's somebody out there who knows it. And it's just down the road from Whitby Abbey, whose name I can now remember. So that's a pretty high rock. The wreck in the foreground is, I don't know, 3-4 meters wide, something like that. But the emphasis very much is on the foreground. Big wide-angle lens, strong emphasis on the foreground. The rock, which is a pretty damned high rock, is still significant because the eye's drawn to it because it's in the center. But in terms of the scale of it, in comparison to the rest of the image, it's not. So it's quite a strong image because of its coloring, because of the foreground ship, but it doesn't necessarily reflect reality in terms of that relationship of scale between the shipwreck and the rock in the background. So yeah, I quite like this style of image because these have a clear focus for the foreground, which draw your eye to a central point in the center. These doing something very similar with portrait format. So yeah, I know the one the castle is actually a little bit on the thirds, but effectively you're using, instead of landscape format, you're using a texture in the foreground to draw your eye to a single feature in the background. So in terms of image construction, then all these are very similar. However, you can see I've used 4 different subjects here: grass, paving, frothy stuff in the water is probably the best way I can describe it, and rocks in snow. So 4 very different subjects, but they've been produced to produce 4 pretty identical images in terms of shape and form. So I reiterate once again, hopefully you're getting the impression that all these images are about how you're using shape, form and detail, rather than I'm going to go and take a picture, for example, of Carew Castle in Pembrokeshire, which is the image on the left-hand side. So try and think in those terms. Like with so many of the others before, depth of field is important, strong foreground texture, and your background subject needs to be very clear in terms of its shape and form, as in these examples. So you've got one single point of view, one single focal point of the background instead of a broad view. These will have more of a broad view, so what distinguishes these from distinctive foreground features and a broader view in the background. So these are visually, dynamically, not as strong because they're less strong in terms of simplicity and image construction. But effectively, they're the same style of image: foreground feature leading to background feature, except these are more, if you like, pictorial, as opposed to these, which have more of an abstract theme to them. Nothing wrong with the pictorial pictures, and as I mentioned before, or if you're selling your work, this style of picture will sell well because people can establish a personal connection with these kind of locations because they recognize them and know them. Using foreground, wide-angle panoramics. I do quite a lot of panoramic images, and there's just a few of a particular style where effectively you've used a lens to create a broad view, where you've got a naturally occurring curved foreground which a wide-angle lens will emphasize and exaggerate to the point where effectively you can use that foreground to wrap itself around the image. Now, anyone who knows any of these locations, and I'm sure there's probably a few people who know at least one of these, will know that all of these foregrounds actually aren't this profile or shape as shown in the picture. But what a wide-angle lens will do is to stretch out the foreground but keep the background roughly in proportion. So, and it will create this effect. Now, the important thing is, with this picture, is to don't drop the foreground out of the picture, so you'll end up with a bit either side. So it has to have a continuous curve. Typically, that means using portrait format because you need to get maximum depth in the shot. So there are a few techniques involved with doing these, but it can be a very effective method. Right, finally, and whoa, we're nearly 8 o'clock, so we need to. I'm going to go through this in a couple of minutes. Composing for highlights and dark tones. So I'm going to quickly. This is the last. I think this is the last section I've got here, unless I'm very much mistaken. Yes, it is. Looking at my little slides in front of me. So highlights and dark tones. So this is why, effectively, this kind of picture is why I got into photography. Strong backlighting, strong, quite dramatic skies, light coming through the sky, shining from above, and this is the kind of image which I would emphasize comes out of the sun having elevation to bring light down from above. So don't always think that you need to take landscape photographs in what we call the golden hour, because these aren't taken in the golden hour. They're taken, 2, 3, 4 hours before or after that, simply because you need the elevation of the light coming down from the sky. So this is why I got into photography. So when you're thinking about your own style and approach to photography, think about why you're doing it. Think about why you're out there in the landscape, why you're taking pictures, and it'll help focus your mind on what appeals to you. Single highlights. Got a couple of pictures I've used the same twice here. So these effectively are largely dark tone pictures which have got a small highlight area, which are just, the eye is drawn straight to the highlight. The important thing about these kind of pictures, have the highlight contained within the frame. Don't have it at the edge, because that will draw your eye into the frame. Combination of composition, post-processing, and also very important use of a graduated filter as well to balance the sky and landscape tone. These are more about a band of light, dark light with effectively, you've got a similar effect with the light in the middle band of the picture. Again, I would nearly always have the light in the middle and the dark in the top and bottom. So effectively, you've got that banding effect of light and dark, which can be quite an interesting effect as well. Again, typically you can see the majority of these are in panoramic format because it suits this style of imagery quite well. These I've just picked out because they've been all achieved in a similar way. The sun in the shot and catching the light on aspects of the picture, whether it's a part of a landscape, part of a building, part of clouds. So the sun has caught part of the landscape. So these are all panoramic photo merges because you need that to get the angle of view, to get both the sun in the shot but also get the reflected point of the sun. Typically you'll be taking this as a panoramic. As I said, with all these, the sun has effectively caught some or part of the image and just picked out part of the feature of the image, whether it's a landscape or in this case Penarth Pier, picked it out from generally dark effect. Dark pictures with small low-key, high-key areas, beg your pardon. So with these, generally very dark, often taken at dusk or dawn, either artificial light or natural light, just to pick out part of the image, draws the eye straight to it. The other thing that pulls these images together is the colouring, reds and blues. Similar style of images can also be achieved by using browns and greys. So the image style on these is very similar to those, but the colouring is different. Again, it's another theme that you can pick on in terms of how you can start to pull your photography together and develop an individual style. So, right, I seem to have got to the end of the presentation. So, on closing, think in abstract terms, use your imagination, try and think of projects or themes for your photography. Start to develop ideas that you can, that in terms of image construction, in terms of how you're pulling your images together, and it'll help you develop a personal style. And of course, as I always say, develop your skills on one of my workshops. So, here are my contact details. I rather like that picture. I save it to the end. There it is. Telephone number, email address, and website. Jay, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nigel. A jam-packed hour with lots of praise and thank you already. So fantastic as always, mate. Huge in-depth knowledge shared there. We have got quite a few questions. So guys, I'm sorry we've reached the 8 o'clock. We will ask Nigel them. So please stay with us. Obviously, if you can't, we are recording this and I will do my best to get it on the site early next week for you. So Nigel, they're not in any particular order, I'm afraid. But I'll ask them as we'll just go down the list. But sorry, excuse me. But guys, I will ask what I've had. We've got quite a few to get through, so please don't add any more at this point. And I should add, in case you are about to log off, Nigel, we're back next week. We're going to continue the theme this time next week, and we're looking at the weather and
the weather.
And see, brilliant. So exactly the same time next week, 7 o'clock Thursday night. Registration link on the website, but you'll all be getting emails from us in a week to remind you on that. Okay, mate, so I'm going to run through these for you. So the first question we had quite early on was, how far do you push your ISO?
My starting point, and I would say virtually all of these shots, ISO is the lowest it can be. Typically, most of my shots, with this style of photography, then the subjects are slow moving and often use a tripod. So ISO isn't a contributing major factor, so I'll simply make sure I keep the, even if I'm using a slow shutter speed, if I'm on a tripod, then it doesn't matter. Now, the odd example might be that image you can see in front of you on the screen in front of you there. Now, that was quite a windy day. So in that kind of thing, a tripod is absolutely no good at all. So if the light level doesn't allow you to use the aperture you want and the shutter speed you want, then that's the time I would increase the ISO. But my default is to always keep the ISO as pretty much at 100, which is on the majority of cameras. They all do vary slightly, the lowest I can. So your default should always be the lowest, because in this style of photography, more often than not, then you can achieve the shutter speed and aperture you want simply by using a tripod.
Brilliant. A couple of people asked, and I know we've addressed this in previous webinars, but obviously we'll ask it again quickly, because obviously it might be the first time that they've spent some time with us, Nigel. How much, sorry, I seem to have taken some water down the wrong way. How much do you do in post? I know the answer to this, but how much is post-production, and what is your what are your go-to things when you are in post-production?
Varies massively. Some of them are simply, they're all shot in RAW for a start, every shoot, and it's something I would, if not everyone is listening in, do, because you get so much more depth of data that you can pull out, particularly in terms of highlight and shadow control. So that makes a big difference. So they're all processed in RAW as a starting point. Now, my starting point is to try and replicate what I've seen with the naked eye. Now, that doesn't always apply, clearly. We don't see long exposures with the naked eye. We don't see black and white with the naked eye. So there are many things we absolutely don't. So, but if I'm taking a color photograph, now my starting point will typically be to see what to try and replicate what I've seen with the naked eye. Now, on occasion, I will think, okay, I want to push that a stage further because I just want to increase the impact of it. And that's often a fine line, really, between what is strong in terms of imagery and what bluntly looks false. And that's something I try not to do. And it does depend on the image. Some are very straightforward, very little bit of raw processing in terms of replicating what you've seen with the naked eye and leaving it with that. Some involve a little bit more, and I've certainly got images I could go through here in which I have certainly processed some more. There are some I've put into sepia to add a brownish tone. Some and something I do quite a lot is to neutralize blues. Now, what we'll often get, particularly in shadows, particularly in skies, is a strong bluish tone. It seems to be emphasized in what you get back through the camera. And I will often neutralize that more to gray, because I prefer neutrality of grays rather than blues. So it really does depend on the image, and I could do a completely different webinar on how I approach post-processing, which is probably a good one for the future, actually.
Excellent. No, definitely. We'll put that on the list without a doubt. Brilliant. I thought this was quite an interesting question, and obviously you've had some several examples of different elements of this tonight. So I'm going to read it as Alan wrote it to us. So you see a landscape scene, you choose an appropriate focal length, you set your composition, lovely. But what do you do about the odd rock, the odd boat, the odd branch that does affect the image? Is that a case of post-production, or do you move, or do you ignore the shot?
Ooh, where do you start? I think it's fair to say the odd branch, remove it, get rid of it in Photoshop. It depends whether it contributes to the picture or not. If it is one which gets in the way, my first thing, obviously, look, when you're there, you choose a composition which is ideally what you want. If, however, you've got to your ideal spot and you simply can't go anywhere else, otherwise you'll track you from your ideal spot. I certainly, if it's fairly minimal, then I will remove it in using some form of cloning in Photoshop. But I can't think of many examples I've done that in. I have got rid of telegraph poles. I have got rid of people. I have got rid of litter. Now, to my mind, things like litter and people, they're only temporary. They're perfect. And sometimes you want people. Sometimes they absolutely add to the scene, and I've got plenty of examples there. Litter, I have no problem getting rid of, because frankly, it shouldn't have been there in the first place. But I suppose I'm reluctant, on the whole, to get rid of things which are part of the view. But sometimes there can be the odd overhang branch that just simply, for one reason or another, you just can't get to a slightly different position. But I won't often do it.
Okay, brilliant. I don't think we've actually touched on it tonight. I know you've talked obviously about using the wide-angle lens, but what are the lenses that, I know we've talked about it past, but for anybody that's new, what are your sort of favourite lenses and your desired lenses for shooting landscapes?
Okay, I've got a 16 on a full frame, which for those of you with crop frames, I've got a 16-35 wide angle, which equivalent on a crop is about 9 till 20 odd, 22, 23. A bit more than that. That's my wide angle, which is kind of the one I tend to primarily use. I've got a 24-70. Again, equivalent on a crop is 16 to something or other. I'm in trouble translating my full frame to my crop frame, and 70 to 200 as well, which I tend to use less, but which is quite nice for long telephoto landscapes, picking out features in the landscape. So those are primarily the lenses I use. I do keep on meaning to do more macro. I do have a macro lens. It rarely gets out of its little bag, which is a shame because it's a lovely lens, but I just don't seem to use it very much.
Brilliant. You touched on this one a little bit earlier when we were talking about sort of how much post-production, but obviously a few people commented tonight on some of the strong colours. So would you find that sometimes you tend to bring them out of the images a bit more, especially with the reds and the yellows and the oranges?
Yeah, I can do. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I thought as much, but we kind of covered that on the last bit, but I thought just double check. When you were talking about the...
By the way, one thing I'd say on that, Jay, don't underestimate the colours you sometimes see in nature. For example, if you see I've had on occasion, if you see, for example, in spring light, sun coming through trees, lighting up vegetation from behind, the greens in spring can be absolutely fantastic. And you almost, when you're actually processing, you always have to tone them down. You always have to go the opposite because they're that striking. Autumn colours, again, can blow your mind away. So these kind of things can, sunsets can. You know, anyone who's out there watched a dramatic sunset, so often you try and interpret that with photography, and it's actually quite hard to do it.
Brilliant, brilliant. You were talking in the foreground section, somebody asked whether do you use any focus stacking techniques by using the foreground interest close to the camera?
No, I never used it.
No.
I found if you're very careful, and in truth, focusing isn't an absolute precise science. But if you're careful on where you select your focus point, and I always use a single focus point, and choose a small enough aperture, then unless you've got a feature absolutely incredibly close to the lens, you should be able to get the depth of field you want. So I have never ever used focus stacking. It's something I've always thought I possibly should try, but it's mainly applicable really to macro photography.
Sure, we come across it quite a lot in the macro photography, but it was interesting to ask. Well, sticking on that sort of the focal length side there, this question sort of comes at the right time. Do you ever consider hyperfocal length in composition, or just select a small aperture to ensure a large depth of field?
You need both. You need both because the small aperture will give you broadly a wide depth of field, but that depends on two other things. It depends on the focal length of your lens, and it depends on the relationship between your foreground subject and your background subject. So those are the three aspects to it. But also, on top of the aperture you use, choosing the position on which the point on which you focus is an equally important part of it for maximizing the amount you have in focus for any given aperture. So that both are important. So it's not one or other, it's both combined.
Brilliant. Just a few left now, we're getting there. So this one came in, and again, a kind of general question really. We were talking obviously about rules of thirds earlier. So as a norm, do you tend to keep the horizon in the upper third, or is it just obviously what you think is best for the image?
Hopefully I covered that really, didn't I?
Yeah, I think so,
in terms of, I mean, it really is about balance composition. Whatever your emphasis behind the picture is, whatever feels and looks right in terms of the image you've created. I don't have a set rule on that. Absolutely not. And in fact, I probably talked about that in more at length than anything else really, particularly in terms of using very low views, low horizon lines, using central horizon lines for symmetrical balance, all these kind of things. They're all relevant.
Excellent. You mentioned briefly earlier about using lenses. I don't know if we actually came across this, but do you ever use any variable ND filters to emphasize the sky?
I must admit, a variable.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, right. The only variable filters I'm familiar with are those variable neutral density filters. I'm not quite sure what the question is asking.
Oh no, that was it. Sorry. Do you use the variable NDs?
Right. Yeah, because they're not to do with sky. They're to do with long exposures.
Oh,
they're
okay.
not per se to do with sky. I mean, the sky detail comes more out of graduated filters.
Yeah? Well, I remember you mentioned that. Yeah, the question was specifically there. So.
Right. Variable ND. I tend to use fixed NDs. So I use the square filter system, which I fix. I've seen some customers of mine come with variable NDs, and some of them actually work pretty well. I'm actually the original ones when they were bought out a few years ago were absolutely dreadful. But I've had customers who come to me with the latest ones, and they're really not bad. And but they do tend to perform. If you use them at extremes, at the extreme darkness, they tend to go a little bit awry. But actually, they're pretty good. But I must admit, I use a slot filter system, and I use fixed ND filters. I've said it once.
Actually, I think with those, this is the last question then, Nigel. So this actually came through a couple of times during tonight, but I kept this one because it sort of summed it up the best. I noticed in some of your images that the sky, some of the foregrounds look like the saturation has been reduced. Has this been done deliberately to give you attention to the subject? I think,
absolutely. I do that quite a lot, and I quite like that look. And it is part of the answer to how much is done in post-processing with those kind of images, where I will often desaturate to bring down to greys and draw attention to the subject. Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Well, actually, that's the last of the questions, but just two things I wanted to share with you before we close. One was thank you for a fantastic hour, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in Sky in February. So that's from Pete, who's obviously already booked on.
Is that Pete Holyoke, who was with me last weekend?
No, I don't see his surname. So
hang on. No, hang on. It's not Pete Holyoke. It's not on the, sorry. Oh, I shouldn't have mentioned his name. That was very bad.
Okay. But there is a Pete who's going to be joining you in February in Sky, and he's looking forward to it very much.
All right.
Another one here. Thank you for the very knowledgeable hour. One of the best webinars I've sat. Thank you. Love the photos.
Oh, marvelous. Thank you very much.
Love the photos. And I'm off to my home village of Carew. I think that's Carew, if I've pronounced it correctly, to reshoot the castle.
Is that the one in Pembrokeshire?
I think so. He's going to reshoot the castle this weekend.
Okay.
So excellent. Well, actually, let's do the unsubtle plug. Obviously, we've talked about it briefly, but there's nothing like, and it's easy for me to say this, guys, but it's the hand on heart and truth, and the people that I know have done it. Spending time with Nigel in the flesh on a workshop is one of the best things you can do if you're into.
Oh, thank you, Jay.
No, well, look at the information that you've shared with us in an hour.
£10 in the post for a very small brown
right, no, it's fine. For everything that you do for us, it's more than appropriate. But seriously, look at what Nigel's done for us in an hour. So if you spend a day or a couple of days with him, your photography is going to just move on leaps and bounds. So just please, go and check out Creative Photography Wales, get in touch with Nigel, find out all the courses that he's got going on. Come and visit us in beautiful Wales, because it is beautiful. I'm lucky enough to know where Nigel lives, and it is fantastic. And if you can't do that, obviously Nigel is moving around with some of his other workshops. So please, please.
And I've got a few more coming up for this year as well, with spaces on too. So
brilliant.
Have a look at the website.
I'll share all of that. I'll share all of that information, as I said I would, with you all tomorrow via the follow-up email, but the information is there in the chat panel for you. So Nigel, thank you so much again for tonight, and obviously let's not forget, you're back with us next Thursday, 7 o'clock again, and we're going to be looking at the weather, the seasons, and the light. So I'm sure it'll be another brilliant.
The one thing that's probably worth pointing out on, actually, I'm still with you, am I?
Yeah, you are. Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that's worth pointing out, while you can work with composition, you can work with ideas. The one thing that you can't predict is the weather and the light.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing that actually makes landscape photography inspiring, because it's the uninspected. Yeah, you get frustrated. There are plenty of times you'll go out and you won't get what you want. There are plenty of times then people will come out on a photography workshop and the light's flat all day, and you kind of have to work with what you've got. But there are some times when it's all worthwhile, and that's the one thing you can't predict.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So thank you, Nigel. That's been another great hour.